Welcome to Heartbreak and Hope with Pat Barbarito, the show that explores how to build up or break down any relationship with confidence, clarity, and compassion. Being a victim of any crime is painful beyond words. Crime victims often suffer a broad range of psychological and social injuries that persist long after their physical wounds have healed. They have these intense feelings of anger, fear, isolation, low self-esteem, depression. But there is something about being hurt by someone that we have loved, that we've been vulnerable with, that we've trusted, that leaves our heart to shatter in a million pieces. Of course, the irony here is that without opening your heart completely, we can't experience the true joy and love of intimacy. Any kind of physical violence is heartbreaking. But when that physical or emotional abuse occurs in the confines of an intimate relationship, that heartbreak is devastating. Intimate partner violence is abuse or aggression that occurs in a romantic relationship. And the intimate partner could be a current spouse, a dating partner, whomever. By definition, it could range from one incident to a series of incidents over years. Today, we're going to talk about the heartbreak of knowing your attacker and the hope that comes with persevering. Today, I'm joined by Matt Troiano. Matt is a partner with our firm and chair of our criminal group. His experiences have garnered the attention of media, most notably multiple crime shows. In those programs, his own experiences as a prosecutor have made him a valuable commentator on notable cases. He's often sought by news agencies to comment on a range of issues such as high-profile criminal cases and legislation. Presently, Matt handles a wide range of matters in private practice. His practice primarily focuses on criminal defense work, child welfare, and he represents victims of domestic violence. Matt joined our firm after having spent more than 12 years as a prosecutor in New Jersey in various positions. In addition to his vast experience, he's well familiar with court systems and has an intricate knowledge of investigations and prosecutions. If you ask me what Matt's most valuable asset is, it's his ability to connect with people and to be empathetic, his desire to drive justice. That's what distinguishes him from others. Matt, let's start with your years as a prosecutor.
As you said in the lead up, I was a prosecutor for over 12 years. And I had this probably unique experience as a prosecutor where I would say 90% of what I did was victim-oriented cases. And what I mean by that is not the store that got robbed or the person that got stolen from, but victims in the sense of physical, sexual, emotional abuse. Starting when I first started as a prosecutor of domestic violence and sexual assault cases. And then the culmination of my prosecutorial career was almost exclusively homicide cases. So I did have this experiences where by and large, all I was dealing with were victim crimes and dealing with navigating that system on behalf of the state of New Jersey, but also on behalf of the victim, his or her family, and getting them through that terrible event or series of terrible events in a way that they could more or less salvage their lives going forward.
Was there a difference when prosecuting a case where the victim knew their attacker versus the victim who didn't know their attacker? I mean, either way, it's soul-shattering.
I would agree with that. Both are victimized and both are left with traumatic set of circumstances. In both sets, the victim that knows their attacker or abuser and the stranger probably come out of it with psychological trauma. For instance, the stranger victim is always looking over his or her shoulder for that next attack. So I'm sure that is terribly traumatic. But there is something more about a victim who experiences abuse, whatever that abuse may be, from somebody that they feel and have or had an emotional attachment to. Because in essence, that is the greatest example of betrayal in a relationship amongst two people. And there's no greater example of that or sadder example of that as being the victim of violence from a person that you love or have affection for, care for, or have a relationship with. That is probably the top of the mountain as far as severity and betrayal.
So that intimate partner violence or domestic violence, what kinds of crimes are the underlying violence? It could be anything from rape to stalking to hitting. I mean, what do you see in the intimate domestic violence situations? What do you see as the underlying crimes or actions?
Obviously, it runs the gamut of crimes that you could have, but you don't have an abundance of murders, right?
Right.
You have an abundance of assaults, and then you have a significant amount of harassment and emotional abuse and control, and all of those things that we think of when we talk about the cycle of domestic violence, where one person is attempting to exert control over the other. In my experiences, I have seen singular events that have been just an incident of physical abuse or sexual abuse, which is obviously terrible in and of itself. In other situations, and probably more often than not, Pat, you see more pervasive conduct. It's not just a singular act, it continues on. There was an act to start it, and then for whatever reason, it continued, sometimes getting worse, oftentimes getting worse. But it would be emotional control, financial control, physical abuse, threats, using anything to the advantage of the abuser to maintain that level of control. Unfortunately, oftentimes it's hard to get yourself out of that situation. What I saw as a prosecutor is that the victim would have to make a decision at some point, either on his or her own, as to, I'm done with this, right? I need help. But that it takes a while to get there. And oftentimes you would have to see a very traumatic situation to lead the person to ultimately get help. And it's almost getting help by necessity, meaning that you could have a bunch of bad things going on, but it's not until, unfortunately, there's a physical assault that necessitates picking up the phone to call 911 to get help that leads to the discovery of all of this conduct.
I think what's so perplexing about intimate partner domestic violence is that there is a very strong connection between the two people, healthy or unhealthy. So this is a person that somebody's placed their complete emotional trust in. And I think it's confusing when things start to go wrong. And Matt, I haven't seen things go wrong in one day. It's usually slow. It's kind of like boiling the water slowly. I see people who are just perplexed like that. I've actually heard people say that couldn't have happened. That didn't happen. They deny it because they can't believe this person that they loved, that they trusted, that they planned their life with is doing this to them, and they doubt their own truth.
I think that you do more often than not see the slow burn rather than just a singular egregious act, without anything else happening prior to. There's a lead up to something bad really happening. When I deal with victims of domestic violence, and I'm doing it, more or less all day, every day, when you ask, what's the history of this relationship? You don't typically find a person say, this has never happened before. I've never seen any indication of this happening before. It might not be to the same level of severity than what brought you to me, but there have been things that have been occurring that has led to this breaking point. And yeah, that's really, really sad, Pat, because you wonder, and I'm not a psychologist, but like, why does this happen? How do we get to the point that this happens? Well, I think that when we're talking about intimate partner violence, there's something to be said about the abuser feeling that he or she could get away with more because it's their significant other. There's more of a comfort level in that situation that maybe if I do something, I'm not going to get in trouble for it. I'm going to get away with it. We have too much at stake for the person to do something, to leave me, to go to the authorities. Whereas if you have a stranger, then there is no such attachment. It is, well, it's very sad more than anything else, but the buildup of that and how it must affect a person to have to deal with that on a day-to-day basis.
You mentioned seeing situations where it's a one-time attack or a one-time incident versus a series of incidents. Have you experienced any resolution of the one-time attack? Have you seen people repair their connection? Because let me give it some context, my question. We all come to relationships with history, right? We all come from somewhere. So the person who's the victim may come from a place of never feeling very good about themselves, being raised in an environment where they were mistreated or not regarded. So they may think all they deserve are crumbs. They don't deserve treatment. And the attacker may come from a position where they never felt power, they felt belittled, so they need to exert power to feel good about themselves. So understanding that we all come from somewhere, and what attracts people to each other is usually that history. But I think the repeated attacker is very different than the one-time attacker. I use the word attacker, probably the wrong word. Do you see a situation where somebody, because I've seen it, really just screws up, has a bad incident, and through therapeutic intervention and work, their relationship repairs? Or is it that one time, one and done, it's over?
Well, it varies. It's, in the eye of the beholder. Not to punt on the answer,
No.
Pat, but it depends on who you're dealing with, right? You may have a person who's subjected to that says, once is enough. If my significant other, lays a hand on me once, then they're never going to do it again. And they're wired that way. And that's perfectly fine. You could have another person who might be, willing to seek some form of intervention that could repair a problem. Not that they're acquiescing and saying that this is acceptable, but for whatever reason, it's typically because there's a relationship and because there are other things at stake. If you are married and you have children and you have a house and you have cars and you have work and you go on vacations and things like that, and then you have this traumatic incident that happens, the victim is in a difficult position of dealing with physical violence, but the physical violence and the physical repercussions are going to dissipate pretty quickly, right? They're going to go away. You're going to get better. But the emotional toll that it takes is going to last for a long time. That person then has to figure out, what do I do right now? Do I, cut bait on my life as I knew it pre-incident and go my own way and figure out my life? Or do I try to, make this work? From my perspective as a lawyer, I find that a lot of my work is being a therapist just as much, if not more, than it is being a lawyer. The way that my mind operates, right? The way that I'm wired is I'm always looking to bring people together. I'm always looking to resolve a situation amicably. I hope that people could figure things out. I'm always looking to give the advice of, is this something that could be salvaged? If the answer is no, the answer is no, and I'll advise you that way. But if it can be, that may be better. And you said it before, I bring my own personal experiences into that. What did I go through when I was younger? What did I see that informs, my judgment and things I want to pass on to clients? But to answer your simple question, it depends on who the players are.
So the one and done, I want to talk about that a little bit, because in the one-time isolated incident, and I always struggle with this as a divorce lawyer, if it's a one incident of domestic violence, one incident of infidelity, it's very easy to judge from afar and say, one and done, I'm out. But what I find when you speak with people and you dig and you peel back the layers, it's not that simple, because, the next day you get up, you make the coffee, the kids go to school, life goes on. And there's an arrogance in saying one and done when you've built a life with someone. So it's confusing. Even as lawyers, we sort of try to navigate the right way to advise people. But if you're in this situation and life sort of returns to normal, it's hard to make that decision of one and done. I think there's a big difference between that and the repeated offender. And then one point, there's a tipping point and people have no choice. Which leads me to ask you this. Now you're an attorney, you're in private practice. And in addition to your criminal work, you represent many victims of domestic violence. And the remedy there is a restraining order, right? That's what you get. You get a restraining order so they can no longer be abused or be a victim. Is there a difference, or what is the difference between that, the restraining order remedy, in a criminal consequence in a criminal matter?
The way that we have it in New Jersey is that victims who seek a restraining order are seeking a civil remedy, basically meaning me against you, two private individuals in a civil capacity, seeking intervention from the court to keep one party away from the other. And an order basically saying that you can't come near me. And if you do come near me, there's going to be consequences. That's what a restraining order is, essentially. It's an order of no contact or limited and prescribed contact.
Can you tell our audience a little bit very quickly about the procedure of a temporary and a final? That's pretty much a standard procedure throughout our states.
So the way that the laws in New Jersey work, and it's similar in other states and other jurisdictions, is that if there has been an incident of domestic violence, you go to the police or you go to the court for what we refer to as an ex parte, meaning that you go by yourself and
or you call them
and you're seeking emergent relief. And by emergent relief, you're saying that there's an emergency where I need court intervention to bar this person from having any contact with me, which means phone, email, text message, don't come to the house.
So what kinds of things trigger the opportunity to avail yourself of the domestic violence laws?
So although it's a civil remedy, right? It's a civil order. It is predicated on the commission of criminal conduct. That gets confusing because then you say, does it automatically lead to a crime? And the answer is no. But in order for you to get a restraining order in New Jersey, there has to be what we refer to as a predicate act. And those predicate acts are crimes. The standards are different, but it is harassment, it is assault, it is stalking, terroristic threats, things like that. So if a person commits one of those acts with somebody that they have or had a relationship with, the person who is victimized would then go to the police or go to the courts, say, I need emergent relief, get a temporary restraining order. But then in order to finalize that temporary restraining order, has to go into court and may have to have what is more or less a trial, a mini trial, to determine if that temporary restraining order should be finalized.
Are you telling our audience that all somebody has to do is call the police or go to the police and verbally report, they hit me, she yelled at me, she assaulted me, and on your word, you could get your spouse or somebody you lived with kicked out of the house? Because that seems a little extreme to me, but is that how it works?
Well, the way that you just said it over the course of that 10 seconds sounds very one-sided.
That's why I challenge you.
Yes, no, in essence, that's the system, right? They are ex parte applications that are granted initially for good cause.
But how does the judge know that they're telling the truth? They're not trying to strategize their divorce case, or they're not just trying to get rid of this jerk.
Pat,
how does the judge determine that?
Pat, I would never suggest that a family law attorney would give advice to somebody to get a restraining order for strategic value.
Because they're under oath. I mean, you are under oath certifying this happened.
Correct.
But how does a judge on a 5-minute application determine if that's a legitimate complaint to kick somebody out, at least temporarily? That seems rough to me.
Yeah, it may be, right? It may be that it is rough, which is why there is a check and a balance there of having a final restraining order in a certain number of days to be able to determine, after viewing the totality of everything, both sides of the story, whether or not this thing should be finalized. But if you take a step back and you say, well, what's the alternative, right? There is a check at that initial stage for the municipal court judge or superior court judge in New Jersey to say, this is not enough. And they could do that. In my experience, those are the exception rather than the norm.
Because no judge wants to be wrong. I mean, a judge doesn't want to make a mistake, and I don't blame them because it could lead to severe consequences.
So yes, just to piggyback off what you said is so important. You get a call in the middle of the night of an allegation of domestic violence and you're a judge. When you say wrong, when you say mistake, The concern, obviously, is that that mistake or being wrong could lead to something that is dramatically worse. In New Jersey, we've totally changed, both in the civil context and in the criminal context, the way in which domestic violence is investigated and looked at. Traditionally, historically, you would see a call to 911, a call to the police. Police would come, and what would they say to the quote unquote abuser? They would say, "Hey, go and cool off, right? Go sleep on the couch, go to your buddy's house, go to a hotel for the night, figure it out in the morning." What we decided through the laws and through our legislature was that is not a good response to this. And there has to be more mechanisms in place to allow for a better structure and more security. So, yes, could it be manipulated? For sure. Is it manipulated? Unfortunately. Should it be? No. But that's why you have the check ultimately down the road by a superior court judge, who for our listeners are our state level judges, to say there is or there is not enough in this particular circumstance.
So is the granting of the temporary restraining order on a ex parte or one-sided application, is that the answer to the more thorough vetting of the complaint?
Yes. So you would go in, you would tell your side of the story, and then you would go before a judge and you say, "Judge, this is why I need this temporary relief." And the standard is fairly low. Is there sufficient cause to grant this on an emergent basis? Because the alternative, again, is if you say no, where do these people go?
So, I've seen people who've made that first call or gone to the police and talk about beginning to be hopeful. There's an empowerment in taking control. You have the heartbreak, but there is hope in someone's heart and in someone's voice when they've made that first step. It's a very empowering thing to do. When I began practicing many, many years ago, I worked a lot with the Jersey Battered Women's Service, and that organization provides remarkable support for victims of domestic violence. And what inspired me in those early years was seeing victims that went through horrific situations, but once they received the support and knowledge, they were often able to go on with self-respect and dignity and lead really productive lives. I hope our audience understands that when you understand what's going on, when you get knowledge, when you get support, you get out of your bubble, you can move forward and look back at this and realize that wasn't a good way to live.
I do think that people in these situations who are victimized often find that the freedom that they find in reporting this or going through this process, albeit very daunting, and you're exposing your private life to a bunch of strangers, which is difficult in and of itself. But once they do it, it's, not to minimize it, but they rip off the Band-Aid,
Yep.
right? And they see things from a different perspective. Win, lose, or draw. I've had many a victim, many a plaintiff say, even though I did not succeed, and this sounds counterintuitive, but even though I did not succeed, just putting up a stand, having a stand against this person to say, you can no longer do this to me, or there may be consequences, means a lot and allows you to move forward and kind of balance the tables a little bit. Whereas the abuser may have thought, I could do whatever I want for as long as I want, and I have that dominant, powerful relationship. You've shifted the balance to make it more equitable, however you decide to continue with your life.
So I think what also happens is, and I've talked about this on other episodes of the podcast, shame is a really powerful driving force. So when people are in shame and afraid to talk about their home situation, domestic violence that's happening, they become weakened, they become crippled. And once you make that first call, once you stand up and say, I don't want to take this anymore, regardless of the outcome, I think shame goes away. And when shame goes away, you become powerful. And that is another advantage of speaking out. The humiliation, the isolation that comes along with being a victim goes away. And you stand up and say, yeah, I'm a victim of domestic abuse. And once people find out about it and your shame lifts, that's a hopeful message. And I've seen people become strong. They've seen people support them that they didn't think would support them. So I think reporting it is also a psychological remedy to healing.
I agree. Now, the difficulty that you see is that these people who are dealing with these traumatic situations have to put their faith in strangers. There's a difference, with all due respect, to me meeting with somebody as a prosecutor and you meeting with a potential client as a family law attorney. They seek you out. I want Pat Barbarito because I know she's been doing this forever and she's an amazing family law attorney. When a crime happens and you are victimized and you're thrusted into the criminal justice system, you don't know who you're going to meet. You don't know who your prosecutor is. You don't know who the players are. So when you talk about shame, use that word, you are then forced into this position where you have to expose your life to strangers. What I, always tried to bring to the table, and I've heard you say it, is no judgment here. I may, in the back of my mind, view things a certain way, which my wife would call judgmental, but I view things a certain way. But there's no shame here. Like, the only way that I'm going to get you to trust me, and the only way that I'm going to get the best outcome, is if all the cards are on the table, and I'm not going to be the one to say to you, like, you've done this wrong, you've done that wrong. I need somebody to open up so that I could achieve that outcome.
If I've learned anything through my years of practice and from doing this podcast, I've learned that giving people the space to share their dark times and their what they perceive as humiliation and lifting that shame is an extraordinary gift. And if as lawyers we could do that, that's part of our job, I understand, which leads me to a question, and you and I talked about this frequently. How do you deal with the victim, either as a prosecutor or in private practice, who constantly wants to reconcile and keep going through that cycle of violence because they just don't know how else to be? How do you deal with that? How do you deal with that frustration of watching somebody keep walking back and back and back? What do you do as a lawyer or as a prosecutor?
Well, there's only so much you could do. You try to give advice, certainly as a defense attorney, or as a private attorney, I guess I should say. You try to give advice, how those decisions may impact a case, how those decisions, just from a personal perspective, are probably not the best thing to do under the circumstances, if you feel that way. As a prosecutor, how that decision may impact a prosecution, which, for all intents and purposes, would probably end a prosecution. So there are consequences to that decision. There's also, the personal component of, especially if you've fostered a relationship with the person, of, do you think that this is really in your best interests? And if you are going to do this, why? Why are you, or how are you internally justifying the decision that you're going to make? From my perspective, and I said before, it's half lawyer, half therapist. Why is it that you are doing what you're doing? And if we talk it through, can I kind of vet that out in a way that maybe it gives you an alternative viewpoint? I'm never going to tell somebody, hey, you have to do this or you have to do that. I'd be remiss to even tell them necessarily that your decision is wrong. I would, however, tell them, like, this is the potential problem that you're going to deal with if you do this.
Not to compare our heartbreak to the victims, but there is a little piece of our heart that breaks when we watch somebody re-enter a cycle of violence. I've watched people re-enter, and I feel so sad for them that they don't feel differently about their life, which leads me to ask you about the impact upon you. You personally, you've represented people who were assaulted by their loved ones, who were victims of crimes, who were involved in intimate partner violence. And how has that impacted your life? I know you're married, you have a wonderful wife and children, but how has that impacted your life? Because you do this day in and day out, and you have for years.
My personality, Pat, is that I could probably sit on a couch across from a therapist for a long time and go through this. It's been a long time in this career of dealing with the worst segments of society. There's no doubt about it. And I think it's incomparable, the things that I've seen as a prosecutor and now in private practice, from death to sexual violence to child abuse, child death. It's the worst of the worst. So it's a lot to deal with. Fundamentally, I want to help people. I've always wanted to be there for people. And I always wanted people to look to me to be the one to get them the desired outcome. And that's not money, Pat. Like that's not, I want to go to Matt because he's going to get me the biggest settlement. Like that's never what it's been about for me. It's been about, succeeding to get justice, to get the right thing for that person. And that's probably what helps me sleep at night. But that's also in a weird way what keeps me up at night, because the burden of that, right, the responsibility and the pressure to get this right is very high. So, you deal with it and compartmentalize it, but I think it fuels you.
I'm always struck by your ability to have empathy for both the assailants and the victims. When you represent defendants in criminal cases, which you do now, or you represent victims of domestic violence. And I really am always impressed and struck by you have an unusual ability to be empathetic to both sides of the coin. And I'm wondering why that is. What is it about you, about your experience, about who you are that allows you to do that? Because that's a very tricky ability.
So two things. Number one, by and large in our system, we have people that are doing bad things as opposed to bad people who are doing bad things. And I say that with confidence, right? People make mistakes and sometimes they're bad criminal mistakes, but there are much less people that are just at their core bad. I've had those people as well. And right now they're in state prison, but I've had those people. But to answer your question, where's it come from? I mean, comes from mom and dad. It comes.
We mentioned that dad was a Superior Court judge, a very well-regarded one. Many, many years ago, I appeared before him and he had great compassion and empathy. So perhaps that's part of it. And mom too. We don't want to knock him off.
No, I mean, it's both of them for sure. But yes, it's the circumstances with which I grew up, the compassion for people, the desire to help. I dealt with family members who had substance abuse issues, right? So I saw that. I dealt with that. So a part of me was always like, well, who am I to judge you because you have a substance abuse issue, right? I've dealt with that too. You look at my house that I grew up in, and you wouldn't think that there's somebody that lives there that has a substance abuse issue, but that's what happens in this world, in this society, right? It looks different inside than it does from the outward appearances. It was instilled on me early on to be respectful to people, to be nice to people, to care for people, to look out for people. I've always wanted to do that. I always wanted to be there to help, to bring things to a resolution. And you get that from your parents. You get that from the way that you were brought up. And I'm thankful for that. It's frustrating at times, Pat, because I take these all on the chin. But that's what I think makes me a good advocate for my clients. Maybe somebody smarter than me as an attorney, more well-read. But this is an attribute that I have. So it works for me.
And I think what it does is it makes the defendant in the criminal case look forward to being rehabilitated. Because if you're not judging them, that person sees themselves differently. I've always admired that capacity you have, because it takes a lot to look at somebody who's done bad things and see that they have a bright path forward, although a difficult one.
Well, you use the word in this podcast, hope. And the premise of this show was to, I think, mostly to talk, if not exclusively, to talk about victims and the hope that comes out of that traumatic experience. But the other side of that the other side of the verses is that there's a defendant. So I represent defendants in criminal cases as well, some who are accused of abuse. There's still, for them, I still feel the same, that I've got to get you through this situation. And the goal is to minimize the damage as much as I possibly can, whatever that means. But I always try to impart on them, instill in them this notion of there's going to be a future, right? There is hope for you, right? You have to get through this terrible event or series of events and get on with your life and hopefully persevere, learn from your mistakes. We say that all the time. You've made this mistake once, don't ever do it again, right?
Or you were the victim of this horrible act once, learn from it and learn how to be more self-respecting so you're not in that situation again.
Yep, 100%. Now we view them differently, right? The defendant made a terrible mistake. The victim didn't put him or herself in that situation necessarily to be victimized. So, the satisfaction to be gained by somebody who's the victim of trauma and abuse who can persevere in the future and move forward. Yes, obviously that feels amazing to me. And I could think of those mostly women, right? I think of women victims who I have dealt with over the years, mostly, if not exclusively, as a prosecutor, who have persevered, who have come from the worst, Pat, the worst situations of rape and abuse and being manipulated, who have persevered. And yes, there is hope for them and for anybody else who is similarly situated to be able to get out of this event and to make a good, productive, successful life.
And of course, families, when there is a victim of a crime or there is a family member who commits a crime, the entire family is affected. I'm thinking about one particular situation when you were a prosecutor and a family member was murdered and you were involved in that family's life. Can you tell our audience about that?
Probably one of the hardest cases I was ever involved with, a murder case. An individual male got killed by somebody he was in a relationship with, which obviously is the worst of circumstances ever. And it turned into, from the point of the crime to the point of the culmination of the prosecution for me, a multi-year event. And I remember with this particular family that the first time I met them shortly after this crime occurred, it was like vitriol. They thought that I was probably less than zero in their
Why?
eyes. It's distrust. It's all the things I told you before. You are dealing with heartbreak, trauma, tragedy, and then you're thrust into this situation of these people who claim to be on your side, but you don't know who they are. You have to put all of your trust in them. So yeah, there is a
So let me
level
just
of
be clear. You were the prosecutor in a situation where this man was murdered by his significant other.
correct. So one of the first interactions I had with the family, and I can remember it like it was yesterday, and they would tell you this story too, how the distrust was palpable, that they just didn't know me, didn't know who I was, and it was tough to get through. But over the years, it turned into such an opposite relationship from one extreme to the other, to the point that tried the case, outcome happened. And at this point right now, they are to me as close to me as really anybody else in my life. I don't see them all the time, but when we communicate, it's the strangest thing to say that you would make a friend out of a situation like this. But the closeness of the relationship with an entire family, it's amazing, to the point that, as you alluded to, when the victim's daughter got married, I was involved in walking the daughter's mother, and I know that gets confusing, the ex-wife of the victim, into the wedding. I accompanied her into the wedding, into the reception, which it's just amazing, but somewhat surreal if you think about it. If a stranger is there and says, "Hey, who's that guy with her?" And they say, "Well, he was the prosecutor on her ex-husband's murder trial," you would be floored. You would not understand that. It's happened to a lesser degree, but somewhat comparable with a whole host of other people, right?
Well, I know that you have an email proudly hanging in your office from a person who was involved in a family murder, somebody who was the girlfriend of the person who arranged the murder of his wife. And I take it she didn't start out as your friend.
No, and total distrust. Again, similar set of circumstances, right? because you have this traumatic event, which in this particular case that you're talking about, she was not directly involved, but she found out that her fiance, for lack of a better description, was involved in a murder. And she was then thrust into this. And she found out that her life was basically a fraud. The life that she thought she knew with this person was fraudulent and fake. So talk about having the rug pulled out from under you, and then having to communicate with all these strange law enforcement agency prosecutors, people like that. Yes, it was built from a level of distrust to having full trust in being able to guide you through this system, because she became a witness in the case, to what you were referring to as an email that hangs proudly in my office.
Well, what she says, because you're not going to be boastful and say it, but I'm going to tell you that she writes to you about how grateful she is, that what you've done helps her sleep at night, and that you found justice. That's got to result in a reward to your heart. And to me, it speaks to the resiliency of the human spirit, how in the darkest of times there is light. And I think those, what you've just talked about, are two examples of people in the worst of times finding a glimmer of hope through justice, through somebody who was a stranger, and self-respecting themselves in a way that their life can go forward. That's got to be gratifying.
There are more examples of that, Pat, than probably you would expect, and not even for me, from others as well. And the word that you use is the right word. There's resiliency there, because, quite frankly, what's the option? You're in the worst of situations. You've hit the floor. You're at the bottom. What are your options, right? Your option is either A, I do nothing and I stay in this position, and, I live an unsuccessful, unhappy, emotional life, or I get up and I move forward. And it's really easy for us to say from the security of our offices, but you find that people do it over and over and over again. They are resilient. The physical scars heal, the emotional damage recedes, may never go away, but it recedes. And there is resiliency in people to move forward, move on with their lives, become equal or better to what they were beforehand. And you see that over and over and over again. That is very, very gratifying.
That is hope. Thank you, Matt Troiano, my partner, my friend. We could continue to talk about this for hours, but I thank you for participating today and sharing your view with our audience. There are laws in place to protect you if you're a victim of domestic abuse. There are people in the system, lawyers and judges, who understand the heartbreak of intimate partner violence. Please understand that there are resources available that could help you therapeutically and legally. And I believe most importantly, lift the shame from being a victim. Owning it, stating it, in many ways eliminates the shame and empowers you, and that gives you hope. Thank you so much for joining us today. Don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Please give us a 5-star rating and leave a review so more people can listen in to Heartbreak and Hope with Pat Barbarito.